sleep is important, but sometimes school, extracurriculars, family obligations, and a social life seriously restrict the amount of these you're able to get. After an insufficient and restless night's sleep, coffee seems like the magic formula to functioning like a normal person. But have you ever stopped to consider what the coffee you are guzzling does to your body? To fully understand the sleep-saving qualities of caffeine, we must look at the receptors in our brains. In our brains, we have cells called neurons. Neurons are cells in the brain that can transmit messages through electrochemical signals. Neurons have receptors located on their plasma membranes that pass messages between cells and throughout the body. Receptors have specific molecules that bind to them based on shape. From one nerve cell, a molecule is released into the synapse, the gap between the two cells, from a vesicle. The molecules travel through the synapse to another cell and can bind to a receptor. Once a molecule is bound to the receptor, it can signal a variety of cellular functions and transmit messages. This can be seen with the neurotransmitter adenosine. Adenosine can bind with the A1, A2, and A3 receptors. The most common adenosine receptor, however, is the A1 receptor. Adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter and slows brain activity and the central nervous system. Your heart rate is decreased, blood vessels dilated, and nervous system slowed. This makes you feel drowsy. And how does coffee play into this? When you drink the coffee, the caffeine enters your bloodstream and travels to the brain. Caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist, meaning that caffeine blocks the sedative and tiring effects of adenosine by bonding to the adenosine receptors. Receptor antagonists block neurotransmitters by competing with them for receptors to bind to. As adenosine enters the synapse and tries to bind with the A1 receptors, the caffeine comes in its place and blocks the adenosine. When caffeine molecules are bound to the receptors, there are fewer receptors for adenosine to bind to and exhibit its drowsy properties. Caffeine is able to do this due to its similar shape to adenosine. The brain cannot differentiate between the two, allowing either molecule to bind to the adenosine receptors. Caffeine triggers your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland is a gland in your brain responsible for producing adrenaline. Caffeine increases adrenaline, increases your heart rate and blood pressure. This makes you feel more alert. Caffeine also releases dopamine, which makes you feel happy. Dopamine is also responsible for making people addicted to caffeine. In addition to all these things, caffeine opens your airways, which also makes you feel more alert. So it's 10 o'clock the night before your biggest final. You have at least 4 more hours of work to do. The biggest question in your mind is not, is y differentiable at x, but will this cup of coffee keep me up tonight when I need to sleep? Obviously, caffeine is not permanently bound to the adenosine receptors. Caffeine molecules will break down and has a half-life of about 6 hours, meaning that after 6 hours, you will feel the effects half as much. Over time, your body can become more resistant to caffeine. After long exposure, your body can produce more A1 receptors. This means that you need to ingest more caffeine to be able to antagonize the adenosine receptors necessary to feel a lessened effect of adenosine. When more receptors are produced, adenosine will bind to these receptors, making you feel tired. This means that in order to antagonize those receptors, you need to drink more caffeine. Some people are more susceptible to the effects of caffeine based on genetics, frequency of use, gender, and age. Some studies show that men are more likely to respond to caffeine because of different hormones in the genders. Genetics also plays a role. The enzyme CYP1A2 is responsible for metabolizing caffeine. Depending how much of this enzyme you produce, caffeine will wear off slower or faster. The enzyme is regulated by the AHR gene, so caffeine's effect on your genes. Another gene attributed to caffeine resistance is PDSS2. While there is still much debate as to if caffeine is good or bad for you, recent studies showed that caffeine could prevent degenerative diseases and stimulate memory. Although, to be quite honest, I'm not sure I'd stop drinking caffeine, even if it were bad for me. Thanks for watching!